Hello, class. All right, so today we're going to start by picking up where you left off in your other notes. I know we didn't have audio for that one, but remember last time, and I'll just go a quick review here. Last time we ended with learning about the Boston Massacre. Okay, that took place on March 5th, 1770. So we're getting closer to the Day of Independence, July 4th, 1776. So we're going to keep talking about the events that led up to the Revolutionary War. Okay. So again, you had the Quartering Act, the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Townshend Acts. All of these acts, in one way or the other, angered the colonists. Some they felt were a violation of their rights, i.e. soldiers possibly showing up at their homes and demanding to be quartered and fed. Mostly it's through the taxation without representation idea, though. The colonies did not have any representation in Parliament. Only people in Britain were elected to Parliament, and only people in Britain could vote for Parliament. So the colonies felt it was very unfair that they were having taxes and laws placed upon them by a group of people who weren't representing them and weren't interested in representing them. They found this as a violation of their rights. That was the colonist point of view. The British point of view was, you're our colony, you'll do what we say. All right, it was very much sort of almost like a parent-child relationship. We talk about the country that owns a colony like Britain as the, quote, mother country. All right, it's like a parent and child. And so Britain was very looking at it as like, look, you're basically our child, you'll do whatever we say, and quit complaining about it. Now, despite the fact the colonists were complaining, they were protesting, they were boycotting British goods, and which had some limited success. The Sugar Act had been repealed. Repealed just means officially taken back. They canceled the law. The Sugar Act had been repealed. The Stamp Act had been repealed. Most of the Townshend Acts had been repealed. Not the tax on tea, but most of the others. So the colonies protesting and boycotting was having an effect. All right. So in the 1770s, Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty set up committees of correspondence. All right, and you'll notice I put that term in bold. So when you're taking your notes, you probably should make note that this is a term you should know. Make sure you underline it, put a star by it. Do something to help yourself remember about these committees of correspondence. So Sam Adams set up, and the Sons of Liberty set up committees of correspondence, which was a group to exchange letters with each other to inform each other about what was happening in the colonies. For those of you who remember your 7th grade Texas history class, Texas did very similar things leading up to their War of Independence with Mexico. All right, so a lot of these, now that came later in time, even though you've already learned about it. So a lot of the things you may remember the Texans doing from your Texas history class last year were things that the colonists, the American colonists, had done 50 or 60 years earlier. Okay, the Texas people who were fighting for the War of Independence with Mexico were very much sort of copying what the colonists had done. So these may sound familiar to you from your 7th grade history class. All right, so in the 1770s, Sam Adams, Sons of Liberty, those groups began exchanging letters with each other to keep each other, informed about what was happening in the colonies. Remember, this is way, way before cell phones and TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and texting and all that sort of thing. All right, you had to keep people informed. You had to write a letter and then have someone deliver that letter, often days and days away. So it was a slow form of communication, but that's what they were doing to keep each other informed of what was happening far away, because usually people often weren't informed of what was happening in other places, or at least not up to the minute. You'd hear about it eventually in your newspaper or through letters like this. But people in, say, Virginia didn't know what was happening in Boston often until weeks, sometimes perhaps even months after it happened. So the Sons of Liberty sets up committees of correspondence so they can keep each other informed on a more regular basis. All right, so let's talk about a very famous event, what I somewhat jokingly, but somewhat not jokingly, term why Americans love coffee, and that's, of course, leading to the Boston Tea Party. Okay, in 1773, Parliament passes the Tea Act. Now, remember, the Boston Massacre had been in 1770. We're jumping ahead 3 years. Parliament passes what's called the Tea Act. And the Tea Act forced the colonists to only buy tea from one company, the British East India Company. All right, now that's somewhat of that can be a confusing name because it's referencing two different countries. It's a British company, hence the word British in it. It's called the East India Company because they are trading and getting things like tea, spices, that sort of thing, from India. All right, if you think back on one of our very first lessons of the year, Columbus and those European explorers were looking for a route to get to India for the spice trade, to get the spices from India. Well, by 1773, Columbus never found India, but by 1773, the British had. And so they set up this company called the East India Company, and who's importing tea from India. And Britain tells the colonists, look, if you want to buy tea from now on, you have to buy it from our company. Okay? The tea would also be taxed. All right, now, the fact of the matter is, tea had been taxed going back to the Townshend Acts, and this tax wasn't any more burdensome. It didn't make the tea more expensive than what was already being paid, at least to the extent that the tea that was coming in legally and not being smuggled. But so the tax really didn't increase what the colonists had to pay to get their tea, at least not from British companies. And also, by all accounts, the tea coming from India was pretty good. So it wasn't even that the colonists didn't like the tea. Apparently, it was pretty good tea. But they didn't like being told what to do. Okay? It was just the idea that someone in London, the king, the parliament, could tell people in the 13 colonies what tea they were and weren't allowed to drink. That made them mad. Right? It'd probably make you mad if say, someone in some other city could pass a rule saying, what your favorite drink had to be. Even if it was a good drink, even if you liked the drink, you wouldn't like to be told that you had to drink it. And this is how the colonists felt. Now, another issue going on here was that the British East India Company wasn't doing so well financially, and so the politicians in London, the king, the parliament, thought, well, if we can force the colonists to buy from the East India Company, well, lo and behold, there's another 1 million customers for the East India Company, and that'll help them economically. So both sides had very different views about what was happening here and why it should be happening. And they had reasons, the colonists at least had reasons to be upset that, wait a minute, because you want to help financially this London company, you're now telling us that we can't buy tea from France or Denmark or the Netherlands or wherever they may be wanting to buy tea from. All right, so it wasn't that, we don't like this tea, the tea's more expensive than what we'd be used to paying. That really wasn't the case. They may complain that that's the case, but in reality it probably wasn't. It was more that they just didn't like being told what to do. All right, so what are they going to do? All right, so this is something I think most of you have heard about. All right. Colonists in many colonies protested, and we've talked about through the Stamp Act and Townshend Act that there were protests going on in the colonies, boycotts, that sort of thing. But the biggest protest of all was what's called the Boston Tea Party. Right. And so on December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty dressed up like Native Americans and boarded 3 East India Company ships. All right, they waited till night. They put on these disguises, although, quite frankly, they really weren't all that worried about people knowing who did it. Everybody knew who did it. It wasn't that they were trying to trick anybody. But nonetheless, they put on these disguises, went on board these ships, and they threw 342 crates of tea into the harbor. All right, and it looks like my video's blocking some of the language here, but what that says is they threw 342 crates of tea into the harbor, causing somewhere between $1 to $2 million worth of damage. Right, now that's in today's dollars, but the tea today would have been worth between $1 and $2 million. So obviously, this is going to get Britain's attention. You know, it's one thing to have protests. It's one thing to burn some stamped paper, which the colonists were doing in response to the Stamp Act. But now you're talking about causing $1 million or more dollars of damage, and it's hard to ignore that. And Parliament does not ignore it. So in response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament wants to punish Massachusetts. So they pass a series of laws. Now here in America, we're going to refer to them as the Intolerable Acts. All right, intolerable is something you cannot stand. You can't tolerate it any longer. All right. Now, in Britain, Parliament called them the Coercive Acts. Coerce means to force somebody to do something against their will. So Parliament was trying to coerce the colonies into basically behaving. Remember, think about this parent-child relationship that how the colonists were viewed by the Crown and by Parliament. All right, people in Britain thought of the colonists as sort of like their children, and so they were going to coerce their children into behaving properly. And like I said earlier, the colonists were going to call these acts the Intolerable Acts. They're not going to be able to tolerate these acts. All right. So what does it mean to be intolerable? I've already answered that question. You can't tolerate it. All right. Think of it sort of like as an annoying little brother or sister, and they just get on your nerves and you can't tolerate it. That's what intolerable means. But obviously here, this is rising to a much, much higher level of just a little brother or sister kind of getting on your nerves one day. This means something that they absolutely cannot live with. All right. And as we're going to see, this law was passed in 1774. The war is going to break out in 1775. So in fact, the colonies are not going to live with it for very long. All right, so these were a series of acts. All right, let's go over some of them. 1, the Boston Port Act. This closed the Boston port until the colonists paid for the destroyed tea. Okay, now if you remember back from our lessons on the colonies and the colonial regions and the different economies, you'll remember in the southern colonies, those were all cash crops. The middle colonies, more diverse, but they had a lot of wheat and grain. They were the breadbasket colonies. But if you remember about the New England colonies, they really didn't have much agriculture, not commercially. They weren't making money by growing things. They were making money by shipping, through trade, all right, through fishing. All right. So when Parliament closed the Boston port, all right, the port is the place where ships go in and out for trade. When they closed the Boston port, they're basically shutting down the Boston and the Massachusetts economy because a lot of their economy was based on shipping. All right, so again, this is why we studied in so much detail the different economies of those colonial regions because their different economies affect their different histories. And so Parliament knew, well, if we close down the port, we can basically kill off their economy. So they're going to shut off their colony by closing the port. That's the Boston Port Act. Then you're going to go to the Massachusetts Government Act. This canceled Massachusetts charter. All right, now that was a vocabulary word we learned early on in the course. Charter is sort of like official permission. It granted the colonists the right to create a colony and to run a colony. So the Crown and Parliament are going to take away Massachusetts charter, and they're going to take away their self-government. All right, they said Massachusetts was no longer allowed to elect officials. You couldn't have town hall meetings unless you had permission. These committees of correspondence in Massachusetts were banned. And then the Government Act put Parliament and a British governor in complete control of Massachusetts. Now remember, Massachusetts, okay, this is where The Pilgrims had landed way back in 1620. They written the Mayflower Compact. All right, and so we've been talking about that almost the whole length of our course. These examples of self-government in the colonies. You had the House of Burgesses in Virginia going back to 1619. You had the Mayflower Compact being written in 1620. All right, so for 150 years, Massachusetts had basically been governing itself. It had a lot of self-government going back to that Mayflower Compact. And then after 150 years, poof, it's all gone. They can't have elected officials. Only Britain can tell them if they can have town hall meetings. You can't even have these banned committees of correspondence. Okay? And by the way, when we study the Declaration of Independence in probably a week and a half, when we later study the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, here probably closer to a month, 3 weeks a month later, remember all of these things that Parliament and the Crown is doing to the colonies that are making the colonies mad. Because when Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, when the Continental Congress, the Constitutional Convention writes the Constitution, they're going to remember these things. And they're going to create a constitution that outlaws many of the things that Parliament's doing. Sort of like not letting people meet. Right? Not letting people express their opinions. That's all going to be dealt with in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution. All right. So the third of these acts, here we go. The Administration of Justice Act. This allowed British officials accused of murder to be tried in England. All right, colonists called it the Murder Act. All right, because they felt, well, you can literally get away with murder. All right, if someone like a soldier, all right, think back to the Boston Massacre. Now, there was, in fact, the trial of the soldiers in the Boston Massacre. Of all people, John Adams defended the soldiers, and he did it successfully. For the most part, they were found not guilty. But when this Administration of Justice Act was passed, colonists think, wait a minute, a soldier can go up and kill someone in America, and he gets to go back to England to be tried? All right, because the thought was, well, they're not going to be fair. They're not going to care as much in England that this soldier killed an American colonist, so there's not going to be justice. All right, so the colonists called this the Murder Act because they felt like it allowed British officials to get away with murder. Next, the Quartering Act. Now, this had revived the old Quartering Act and went even a little step further and said the British Army could basically take any empty building for their own use. All right, so if there was a building in the colonies that wasn't being used, or in Massachusetts that wasn't being used, the British Army could just take and say, okay, this is ours from now on. We're going to keep using this. Now, we remember back when we talked about the Quartering Act, that was unpopular to begin with. Now, the Parliament's going to bring it back, make it even more of a burden on the colonies. So, as you can imagine, it's going to make it even more burdensome. Finally, the Quebec Act. This placed all land, and therefore all trade, between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers under Canada's control. All right, so remember, what did we have in 1763 that first started making the colonists mad? You had the Proclamation of 1763, which told the colonists, hey, thanks for helping us fight the French Indian War and getting all this land from France. I know, by the way, we're going to expect you to pay for it, but you can't use the land. All right, well, this is what this Quebec Act, in effect, was taking even one step further. They said, okay, not only are we not going to allow the 13 colonies to use any of this land we took from France after the French Indian War, but just to sort of rub it in, we're going to go ahead and give it to Canada. We'll let Canada use it, but you 13 colonies, you stay out of it. So again, going back to the Quebec Act, which goes back to the Proclamation of 1763, this new Quartering Act, which went back to the initial Quartering Act, all right, in like 1765. All right, Parliament now has no qualms about doing things they know are going to be unpopular. They knew these acts were unpopular in the colonies, and to some extent, they had been backing off in the late 1760s. That's why they had repealed the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, etc. But now, after the Boston Tea Party, after the colonists destroyed $1 or $2 million worth of the East India Company's property, Parliament's pretty angry. The king's pretty angry, and they're not going to have much sympathy anymore. So they're going to revive these laws that they know the colonists didn't like to begin 10 years earlier, and they're going to put them back on the books and make them even stronger. So, now as we've been seeing since the Proclamation Act, Parliament does something, the colonies react. Parliament does something, the colonists react. So what's going to be reaction to the Intolerable Acts? Well, in September 1774, all of the colonies, except Georgia, sent delegates, again, that's another name for representatives, to a meeting in Philadelphia. And this meeting lasted 2 months and was called the First Continental Congress. All right, and so why this is so important is, as we've been discussing throughout this course, and the 13 colonies before now had always acted completely independently. All right, you had 13 colonies with 13 governments, and they really considered themselves to be British and to be separate countries from one another. If you had asked someone from Virginia, what country are you? What's your nationality? He or she would have said, well, I'm British or I'm Virginian. But they wouldn't have said I'm American or I live in 13 colonies. That really wasn't a concept to them. These colonists all thought that whatever colony they were living in was separate from the other colonies. It was sort of like having 13 independent countries almost. Now, they were all part of the British Empire. They were all colonies of Britain, but they really didn't see themselves as being a unit. Think about our name now. It's the United States. Back before the 1770s, those colonies really weren't united. They didn't see themselves as a united country. They really viewed themselves as 13 separate countries under the British Empire. But in 1774, this is going to change, because the colonies, with the possible exception of Georgia apparently, were so angered by the Intolerable Acts. And now the Intolerable Acts really mostly just affected Massachusetts. But the other colonies thought, well, if the Crown and Parliament will do that to Massachusetts, then they'll do it to us. And this was really the opposite effect that Parliament wanted to have. Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts as a warning to the other colonies. If you get too far out of hand, if you start destroying millions of dollars worth of property, we're going to take your rights away. The Intolerable Acts were meant to scare the colonists, but they had the opposite effect. They drew them together. All right? They gave them a little bit more courage to stand up for themselves, because they realized, well, if the Crown and Parliament would do that to Massachusetts, then they'll do it to us sooner or later. So the colonies get together at the First Continental Congress, and this is the first time that there looks to be something like a legislature. All right, so if you're on my Zoom calls, you know what we do. When you hear that word legislature, all right, make an L, L for legislate, L for laws, okay? The legislature is the branch of government that makes the laws. And so this was the first time in America in 1774 that there's going to be something like a national legislature, that there's going to be a unified action among all of the colonies, okay? And it's only going to last for a few months. It's not permanent yet. All right, that's still going to take another year or two. But it's a big, big step. Heretofore, when we talked about Franklin's Albany Plan of Union or certain protests or committees of correspondence, the colonies were taking a little bit more of baby steps toward becoming a united country. The First Continental Congress isn't a baby step. It's a big step now. And it's going to be a big step towards ultimately leading to correspondence here in less than 2 short years. Okay. So again, 20 years after Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union, the colonies are starting to act united. I know you probably can't see that word united because my video's in the way. For the next video, I'll either take it off or try to see if I can move it to a different location. But for now, that just says the colonies are starting to act united. All right, that's what's covered up there. All right, so what did the First Continental Congress do? One, it banned all trade with Britain until Parliament repealed the Intolerable Acts. All right, and remember, the colonies were, there were a lot of people living in colonies by this time. They were one of Britain's, a big customer for British companies. And we'd seen boycotts in the past, but the First Continental Congress is going to say, look, we're not going to boycott paper or sugar or this or that. We're just not going to have any trade with Britain anymore. Just all of it's gone. And so it's really going to put financial pressure on British merchants, British companies back in Britain who are selling things to the colonies. Two, the Continental Congress told the colonies to start training troops. So the fighting hasn't started just yet. That's going to wait until 1775. But here you see late summer, early fall of 1774, the colonists are preparing for war. They're starting to understand boycotts are probably not going to be enough. We're going to have to fight. All right, let's pick up here in the next one. So that'll end this lecture. I'll do another lecture where we really build up to the actual fighting breaking out.